Welcome to Field Talk, a Monitor Farm Scotland podcast. Join our host, Wallace Curry, as he explores the stories from Monitor Farm networks on how farmers have adapted their businesses with support from specialists and experts to assess farm performance and explore opportunities. Monitor Farm Scotland is farmer-led, farmer-driven, encouraging discussion and solution-based thinking.
Welcome back, everyone, to Field Talk, the Monitor Farm podcast. This series has been very much more dedicated to sort of projects and technologies that are being implemented and carried out, should we say, through the Monitor Farm programme. The last series, if this is the first episode you've came across, first off, hello, nice to have you here. And secondly, that if you want to sort of go and hear the background of the Monitor Farm programme, which is bread and butter, is the farms themselves. The whole first series, apart from one episode, which I think was actually a two-parter, so technically two, was focusing on those Monitor farmers around Scotland. So go listen to that there. The next episode we'll have after today is going to be looking at forage with Kirsten Williams and Alex Stephen. But today we've got what I think is going to be a really good chat on a topic that I think should be more what would I say, more discussed in our sector, something that's probably new when it shouldn't be in a lot of ways. And we'll get into what that is in a minute. But I want to introduce you to our guests first. We have Chris Clark and Angus Walton. Gentlemen, would you like to say hello?
Yeah.
Wallace, hi.
How are you
Hi,
doing?
Wallace. Thanks for having us.
Here, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. He's both keeping well.
Yeah. Need some rain.
It was going to be either my next question or I was going to leave it as long as it took because I knew it was going to be coming. Have you just not had anything? Yeah.
We've had a bit.
Dry.
Enough, Chris? Or
No, it disappeared for about 2 or 3 mil into the ground, and that was it.
yeah, it's pretty intense out there. I mean, I'm from Arran in Scotland, and we're not used to this. As I know, some of us in here are also not used to this, and it's yeah, a bit of a shock to the system. It's nice when you're not put your farming hat on, but it's yeah, we do need a drop, that's for sure. We'll hear a bit about each of you guys. We're here to talk about maximising sustainable output, which is a term that people listening might not know a massive amount about. But we'll get into that as we go. So just purely because you're on my camera first, Chris, could we just have a bit of background about yourself and Nethergill Associates?
Sure. I'm a farmer, trained agricultural college, ended up after college milking in Pembrokeshire on a early potato and dairy farm, and then got offered a farm management job in Berkshire, Buckinghamshire really, actually. And then after that, set up my own tenancy with my wife, and there we started our farming career, producing outdoor pigs, outdoor pork, and we ended up selling pork into 65 butcher shops, some of the top stores in London, Harrods, Selfridges, Fortnum's. But that wasn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to actually own our own farm, and so we sold that business well. I retrained in business management and marketing, and my wife retrained in graphic design. And we ended up setting up a marketing consultancy, which was successful enough to buy a farm, 400 acres in North Yorkshire. And all my management consultancy and agricultural experience did not create a profitable farm business model. And it wasn't until we started reducing output, or more particularly reducing inputs that reduced output, that we began to actually, if I'm honest, reduce the losses on the farm. And that allowed us to move to, or we were then asked to look at this model on other people's farms, and the management consultancy experience kicked in. And I teamed up again with a friend of mine called Brian Scanlon, who's a physicist and mathematician. And we've ended up looking at and reviewing now well over 360 farm business accounts. So the empirical data that we have now is significant. We've got about between 100 data points and 175 data points on each farm business. So we review farm businesses, and that's what we do now. And we now know that there's a sweet spot a point of maximum sustainable output on every single farm. It doesn't matter whether it's at 2,000 meters, 75 meters, whether it's dairy, arable, or livestock, mixed livestock. So in effect, we are advising farm businesses how to be more profitable, but particularly more profitable on a pre-support basis.
Now, I'm not expecting to reel off 170, but could you give us a few examples of those data points that you're focusing on?
So we do look at real farm data, but we are concentrating hugely on business data, break-even points. We're looking at the variable costs. We're looking at fixed costs, but we're looking at it in a very particular way, in a hierarchy. So we will look at your pre-support revenue, take off the variable costs, and look at a first contribution. 18% of the farms that we've reviewed do not cover with their pre-support revenue their variable costs. They are in effect pinning a £50 note on the back of an animal as it leaves the farm gate, because the revenue is not covering the fertilizer and feed bills that they're using on farm to drive output. We then use that first contribution to take off the fixed costs, and 80% of farms do not cover their variable and fixed costs on a pre-support basis. And even when we add back in support, 20% don't come out positive, even with support.
That's a stark figure.
That's huge. And so when we're, so those are the sorts of things we look at. So we're looking at break even. We're looking at the energy balance, how much energy you're using to create the food, which is fuel, which is energy. We're looking at the return on total assets. We're looking at a natural capital valuation. We do need data from things like number of animals, LSUs, how much wheat you have, how much barley you have, the type of animals that you have, how much milk you're producing. But our primary focus is to look at where the business is. I mean, I can't tell people how to farm. I may well be a farmer, but they'll have forgotten more about their farm than I'll ever know. So we look at business.
Yeah, brilliant. And Angus, a bit of background to yourself.
Yeah, okay. So Angus Walton. I farm in sort of southeast of Scotland with my parents at Peelham Farm. Notice the sign. I've grown up on Peelham my whole life, so I've been here, not much change out of 40 years. School, university, after uni, I got the opportunity to sort of really explore one of my passions. I studied countryside management at university, studied at Newcastle, and biochemistry just couldn't hack it. I'm honest, put my hands up, couldn't hack it. So biochemistry and genetics. The funny thing is, had I known at the time that I would spend an awful lot of my farming career focusing on genetics, that's the irony in all of it. I didn't need that degree to teach me about genetics in a farming context, to be honest. But anyway, so university. After uni, I then traveled the Northern Hemisphere and dabbled in the Southern Hemisphere as a fishing guide. So I spent many years and a couple of years in Russia, little stint in Norway, Iceland, with the company I worked with, and then went to New Zealand. And so that gave me a really unique insight into humanity's existence within wilderness regions, untouched, complete, unadulterated wilderness, and preserved as such. And then came home sort of for my travels 2014, 15, had a brief stint with another company prior to coming home, and then just realized my calling to the farm was just, it was overwhelming. And I just thought, right, I'm just going to have to come back. Parents, the dynamic. And I suppose ever since I was a small boy, right through university, and schooling, I was always kind of gearing myself to farm. I think that's kind of the general trend, is that when you commit to farming, it's a life commitment. It's not just, you can't learn how to farm in the back of a textbook. It takes knowledge transfer, it takes experience, it takes community, it takes relationships to really harness the power of agriculture and living within the landscape and balanced landscape. So anyway, yes, I came home in 2015, and that's where my journey really started to pick up momentum, especially in agriculture. And we were organic. We were running sort of 600 ewe flock with a sort of fairly small 60 to 70 head pig breeding unit for our on-farm butchery. We had about 80, 90 sucklers at the time. And I guess my journey to where I ultimately met up with Chris in, I think it was the autumn of 2021, was one of slamming my head against a brick wall. And it really forced me into reconsidering what it was to be a farmer with my past experience. And we live right on the cusp of the Tweed Valley here at Peelham. So I look out right across the Tweed Valley, across tens and tens and tens of thousands of acres of arable farming. And I guess my conscience kicked in a little bit. And I thought there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so before I really knew about MSO, I started to consider how I become profitable. The industry was telling me a way of farming that wasn't profitable. I mentioned it earlier, I was encouraged to treat, to mechanize, to feed, to maximize, and then to overcapitalize my business. As a young farmer, that's what I was told. That's how I was told to farm. Mm-hmm. And in reality, so actually back to this story, we started realizing that I just couldn't run 3 enterprises. And so we had to make choices, and we got rid of the sheep. 2018, Beast from the East was kind of that final nail in the coffin. And then the pig feed situation, 2018, 2019, dry harvest, organic pig feed just went through the roof. And I thought, you know what, our business can't sustain this sort of degree of hike in pig feed. We weren't on feed-based contracts. We were trading into our butchery. And I'm rather glad we did, because ultimately the sad, inevitable outcome of the Ukraine situation was pig feed just went. And so we came out of pigs, and I guess intuitively I always wanted to just be cattle. I love cows, always have, ever since I was a young boy. I think it's in the name, Black Angus cattle. And but then I just got a sense that the ecosystem services that they also provide were going to cater for, being honest here, a fairly large mental health problem that I ended up running into that I'm not afraid to hide behind when I was working 360 plus days of the year, 14 hours a day. And so the ecosystem service that the cattle provided just ticked so many boxes. And so we went all cattle in 2018, 19. And the rest is kind of history. And I just started reevaluating everything, having complete confidence in the genetics of our herd and their ability to thrive, I suppose is the right word to use, in a super low input dynamic. And I haven't been disappointed. In fact, quite astonished actually how the productivity of the herd increased the less I did. Yeah. Sounds a bit daft, right? Bit counterintuitive. But that's where we are now. So I hope that was a bit of an insight into my journey.
The fishing in Russia is definitely an out there one, Angus. That was, how long did you do that for? Did you say 2 years?
Two seasons, yeah.
That'd have been quite something. 2 seasons, so you went out not for the full year.
May till October, so early May till early mid-October.
Fantastic.
But it's dark for the rest of the year. So.
Yeah, well, that's right. Trying to hear the fish instead of We've touched on MSO. We've mentioned it throughout the first 15 minutes of this episode. Chris, I think you're probably the best person to sort of just give us a full, what actually is it? What does it encompass? We've sort of touched on things, but tell us the full sort of definition, I guess, of MSO.
Well, if you'd asked me this 3 or 4 years ago, I wouldn't give you the definition that I'm going to give you now. because we didn't understand why what was happening was actually happening. But at the end of the day, farmers are actually producers of energy. They're converters of energy. They convert solar energy into food products. And food is a fuel, and fuel is energy. So everything that farming does is predicated on the energy in and the cost of it, and the energy out and the price of it. Farmers in the UK have access to 250 million nuclear power stations worth of sunshine. And the conversion losses are huge, absolutely huge. But that free issue, photosynthetic energy, comes free. And you cannot beat the ability of a farmer with ruminants to convert that solar energy into highly nutritious food. And so the MSO point effectively calculates how much energy the farmer has used in producing the food, whether it's free issue solar energy or industrial energy. And it creates this sweet spot, the MSO point, where the farm is in balance. And when you hit that sweet spot, that MSO point, you maximize profitability because you have reduced your industrial energy down to a very low point. You cannot get more energy out than you put in. The energy that goes into the manufacture of fertilizer can never be recovered in the food that you sell. If it could, you would have a perpetual motion machine. And it can't. So we have been taught, I was taught at college, to drive output, and to drive output at any cost. And in fact, that has never worked. Not truly, not if you do the calculations properly. And so you have to account for the free issue photosynthetic energy in a different way to the way you calculate and account for the industrial energy. So if you go to MSO, you'll be at maximum profitability, you'll optimize for nature, and you optimize because the nature is uncompromised, unadulterated by industrial energy. You will minimize the energy requirement on your farm. And lastly, you will maximize natural capital, the value of natural capital. And the reason for emphasizing the 350, 360 farms that we have reviewed and the number of data points is that the empirical evidence is so significant now that it's almost guaranteed that if you reduce your industrial energy input, you will be more profitable.
That sweet spot's an interesting thing because, and correct me if I'm wrong here, someone could listen to that and think there's an across the board sweet spot. I'm going to guess that varies hugely depending on system where that sweet spot is. And is there a notable period of time in finding where a sweet spot is in a unit?
Okay, so a couple of things. When we calculate an MSO for someone like Angus, it is only valid for that moment in time.
For sure.
Next year, it'll be in a different spot. It may not be very far different, but it'll be different. The key is that you need to watch the trends. And to move to MSO, you can go cold turkey, and one or two farms have, 2 or 3 farms have, in fact. Or it is best to try things out to reduce your inputs first and see how that affects your yield or the number of cattle or the number of sheep that you need to reduce by. And that happens over a period of 4 or 5, sometimes 6 years. And what happens is, particularly if you reduce the nitrogen fertilizer, is that the symbiosis between the mycorrhiza and the plant roots, and that creates its natural fertility, reestablishes itself. And we're finding that the MSO actually moves to the right. As your stocking rates come down or as your yield comes down, they will eventually begin to re-establish themselves and go back up again over a period of time.
For sure, of course it is, and there's always context, isn't there? And it's going to change year on year, which is it just seems like what should make sense. It seems like we haven't all said this, but two of us have spoken about being at agricultural university or any form of whatever it was, education and learning about output, increase yield, increase daily live weight gain, whatever that might be, doesn't matter. And we touched on the start of cutting costs here and there. It was a mention, but it was never really a focus. And it's quite crazy in my head now that I'm aware of what you're talking about, Chris, but I can't say it's crazy because I never come up with it either, that this hasn't been more normal for longer.
Indeed, and Wallace, if I refer you back to the stats I gave earlier, which is 80% of farms on a pre-support basis do not cover their variable and fixed costs. If we carry on doing what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always got, which is a requirement for support to get us out of a hole. And actually, that support has masked two really important issues in farming, which haven't been truly recognised, I don't think. Firstly, that support has hidden the decapitalisation of farm businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're making a loss on a pre-support basis, you have to cover that loss quite often by selling assets. You're decapitalising.
Yeah.
But almost worse, there's a positive feedback loop here where when you use industrial energy, for example, nitrogen fertilizer, that nitrogen fertilizer is causing the symbiosis between mycorrhiza and plant roots to disappear, and that is causing the decapitalization of natural capital on farms.
Mm-hmm.
And so this concept of industrial energy driving output, it will drive output, but it is driving loss as well. And we've been, instead of driving output as a measure, yield, LSUs, maximizing LSUs, we should be using one measure only, and that's profitability.
At what point, I'm going to struggle to articulate this, but I'm sure it'll make sense enough that you'll understand what I'm saying. Profitability for a business has to be number one. It's got to be. We're also dealing with animals, though, so animal welfare arguably has to be number one. Sustainability arguably has to be number one. How much do they all tie in together? Is profitability right, first pillar, and then
if you compromise or abuse the nature or the natural capital on your farm, your profitability will go down.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And if you abuse animal welfare, if you abuse animals, you're also going to affect your profitability. We don't need to go into that, but the relationship by working with nature rather than substituting for it is only going to enhance profitability. But it will only go to a certain point because the amount of natural capital you have on your farm is finite. It's not like a factory where you can buy another machine and increase productivity that way. Farming has a finite amount of natural capital, and you need to maximize, as a farm manager or as a farm owner, you need to maximize the productivity from that finite amount of natural capital.
Yeah. It almost feels hard to ask questions because everything makes so much sense. Normally,
well, I mean, another way to put this, Wallace, is that farmers who are not profitable, pre-support minus variable cost minus fixed cost, who are not in the black at that point, are having to fund the daily working capital requirement of that farm business from support.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they need to be getting to a point with that second contribution where it not only funds working capital, daily working capital, it funds the drawings of that farm.
Yeah, for sure.
That what are farmers worth? Are they worth the same as a joiner, a plumber, an accountant, a lawyer? Well, any of those, but they actually pay themselves 7.5p an hour or whatever it is. And actually they're worth minimum £50 an hour.
Well, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Minimum.
Angus, I want to take you back to when you and Chris first met and you started to look at MSO officially. Was what MSO is something you were already kind of doing on the farm anyway, or was this a change in system towards it? I know you talked about sort of changing enterprises on the farm, but was the core sort of intent of MSO what was already happening at Peelham?
I think before I really knew what it was, I had already started to go down that road of reevaluating the way I farmed. I even, well, I'll tell you what it started with. It was over being inspired by the way an awful lot of large scale Aberdeen Angus ranches in the United States have achieved a balance between large scale ranching and wild game management, where the cattle essentially were living in as close to a wilderness region productively within an American context as you could achieve. And that inspired me. I was like, so the genetics are telling us something that there are animals in this land that, that are available to us that can not only be productive in terms of the amount of meat that it's producing and the profit margin that they produce, but also that the maternal bloodstock can deliver in essentially a wilderness region. That was something that really inspired me. And that comes back to my background, having worked and traveled all over the world. So when I came home, I started really, well, in my transition to cows, I knew that I wanted to go grass only. That's another thing to add, actually. The business was Pasture for Life certified at that point. So I suppose I was kind of thrown in the deep end. Kind of, you will fatten on grass, and that's it. And I was like, right, okay, well, okay, that's going to be a bit of a headache, but let's see what we can do. And so I just attacked that problem head on. In my opinion, sort of every challenge was a solution, opportunity. Let's go and tackle it head on. And I started making phone calls. And it transpired that if you look hard enough, there are genetics out there still in the UK. They're few and far between that will convert grassland in a dynamic like ours and deliver a carcass to our cutting plant at a profit. And so I was like, right, well, the genetics works. We know that. Okay, I've got some of them. Let's see where that takes us. And as I went down that road and I pushed it hard, I spent every waking minute, focusing on genetics and the cattle system that I had back then. But then I just started to see these really significant improvements in some of my land-based KPIs: grass growth, grass recovery, moisture retention, because I was carrying tall grass grazing. I went nuclear on tall grass grazing. I just thought, right, I'm just going to do this. It works for biodiversity. It works for me. I love it. Let's give this a crack. And I then thought, let's reverse engineer my figures. I know that the cattle can stay outside, but I'm housing right now. Why am I housing? I'm buying 2,000 bales of straw. I'm making 2,500 bales of silage to house cattle that arguably could be outside. And so I thought, right, how many cows does it take to pay for my bedder, my diet feeder? How many cows does it take to pay for my straw, my silage? And then just reverse engineered it. Really simple, nothing complicated. And suddenly my herd was down to like 30 cows. And I was like, 30 cows? Is that where I'm making any headway in profit? It's 30 cows or something like that. So I was like, right, well, actually, I could run 30 cows on this farm and never see them in a tall grass grazing dynamic because I know they would thrive. So that kind of brought me to the mindset. I thought, well, there's got to be an optimum here. There's got to be an optimum number of units that this farm can carry and the dynamic that I was working towards. And I've really started to search for that number. and I put in place a whole load of KPIs that started feeding the data back to me in terms of, well, yeah, live weight gain, kill objectives, what my kill targets were, where my on the hook weights were, and feeding back into the profit and loss. And so with that in mind, I focused on it. And then Chris and I crossed paths, and I listened to a webinar of theirs in the autumn of 2021, and this light bulb went off in my head. I was like, oh, yeah, that's what I need. That's what I need. It joins the system with the numerics of the system. And because at the time there was nothing really there that actually could fill that void for me. And yeah, we've kind of been in communication ever since, really. And so that was kind of, so yes, to answer a long-winded way of answering your question, yes, I had been doing it, but not specifically MSO, but something similar.
What he didn't mention there, Chris, was when we spoke on the phone, his words to you were about you was fascinating guy, but I'm just throwing that out for you.
We've got to know each other quite well.
For sure. You mentioned about genetics there, Angus, and I think the term you said was few and far between in the UK. Do you see that increasing?
Yeah.
And do you think it already is, or do you just foresee it increasing?
Two things. We don't have a choice. Okay. And secondly, I think the farmers in the know who are at the coalface are just realizing that, we need to change. We need to go lower input. We need to be much more aligned with nature. We need to be much more aware of our climate. We need to be much more prepared. Preparedness is a critical factor. And so, yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I'm having more conversations. Back then, there was very, very few people having this conversation. Now, there are a lot of people having this conversation.
And you mentioned about taking challenges head on. So a challenge is an opportunity, a very progressive attitude, the way we should all look at problems, challenges, whatever we want to call them. What were some of those challenges you were seeing in that period of time?
The big one, exactly on this conversation, profit and loss. Yeah. That was the big one. Secondly, lifestyle. I had some fairly significant infrastructure objectives I needed to fulfill. The farm had been farmed as an arable unit for almost 50 years before we took it on back in the early 90s. I think I knocked up somewhere in the region of 45,000 meters of new Rylock fencing myself, and it's never stopped since. I'm still fencing today. That's what I was doing before I came on. And also mindset, the big succession word. Change, embracing change, having the opportunity to change, the openness and the dynamic to embrace opportunities. But then I think, I'm going to say this a bit controversial, I think the industry, that was a big challenge, was kind of going out on a limb and doing something that I think the industry would perceive to be a little bit cracked, we carried 120 cows through last winter, or 120 adults, that's young stock, and it's basically cows, on 270 bales of hay last winter.
Wow.
Grazed the whole lot all the way through the winter and supplemented them in that, So that was a big challenge. Kind of, a lot of it's mindset, right? You've just got to have the faith in your system and faith in nature, and just go, right, we've just got to give it the best shot, because the opportunities for farmers, especially in my generation going forward, we've got to be open-minded to change. If it's not open-minded to change, it creates barriers that I think we can't afford as businesses. And that's it. Businessmen, but businesses got to be focused as businesses.
It's got to be, 100%. Couldn't agree more. And you mentioned mindset a bit. You said earlier about 14 hours a day. I think it was over 360 days. So maximum 5 days holiday in the year.
It's horrendous.
You talked about mental health. When things are getting better from a profitability perspective, from your cutting cost perspective, yes, your output's lower, but you're trying to find that, as Chris says, sweet spot, and things are looking better. Does that alleviate those mental health struggles?
Oh, where do I start? That's Pandora's box.
Let's open it.
Yeah, I mean, oh, mate. Well, I've I've taken part in media events and podcasts before and had open conversation with researchers specifically talking about mental health and regenerative agriculture or agroecological agriculture, kind of, coining that phrase. And so the old move to MSO, you're not having to bust yourself 24/7 to deliver the same outcomes. In fact, you're working less, achieving greater outcomes. And I mean, you don't have to push so hard. You don't have to push for the high carcass weights because you've got the resilience in the system. I mean, our carcass average, it's now sitting around about 290 kilos on the hook. Okay, arguably, I start killing at sort of 16 months. So some of those Anguses will finish extremely quickly, but because it's on grass, you're just shifting fences and you're just grazing. So I'm even using horses now to move my cattle. So we've got 2 quarter horses in the dynamic, and we're kind of adding that on as a bit of a diversification as well. And so everything starts to slow down, but the business doesn't suffer because of it, and it allows me more time with my family. Allows me to do more things that I love. It allows me, and you see, I can see more. I can actually lift my head and look in the hedgerow for once, and appreciate what's there, and hear the noise of the curlews as they fly over the landscape, and just, you know what I mean? It takes me right back to Iceland, 2014, where I was being bombed by Iceland as I was flying my drone over, it's amazing. So you just get at times to appreciate what we're doing more.
Doing the things you love more of, such as fencing.
Oh my God, I'm so sick of fencing.
Chris, I'm going to ask you a question that's surrounded around business management, maybe even more economics, and you're definitely going to see my lack of knowledge of that sector here. But when we're looking at trying to create a sector that utilizes MSO, I guess, is your goal. You're seeing reduced costs going into inputs across the board, which then in turn is going to create profitability, but your outputs across the board are going to be smaller. So you're going to have a smaller supply of whatever product we're producing, doesn't matter, just across the board agricultural commodity. Is that not going to see an increase in price and then make it less buyable, shall we say, by the consumer, or am I being stupid there?
Yeah, not at all. 2 observations. As you reduce industrial energy inputs, FERT, feed, non-essential vitamin sprays, as you reduce that, the MSO will move to the right, and which means that your yield is increasing again. You may not get back fully to where you were with fertilizer and other inputs, but it will increase. So there should not be the concern about food security. And while we're on food security, how can we have a viable food security policy when the industry is loss-making? Surely the primary requirement of the food security policy is to have the elements that supply the food to be profitable. 80% don't do that. We do not have a food security policy with the existing farm business models that we are pursuing. Okay, and you mentioned price. If Angus lifts his price of beef, if he had that opportunity, I mean he does, because he sells it into the processing. But if a farmer has the opportunity to lift a price of beef by £1, what happens further down the supply chain? Well, what the elements down the supply chain do is increase their costs, or the price up to the next level, by a percentage. What if they only lifted their price by the amount per kilo that Angus had lifted his price by? The price on the farm shelf would only lift by 5%. Mm-hmm. It is because we have a percentage modeling going through the supply chain that we get to the level of food prices that people can't afford or don't want to afford. So again, there's a modelling issue going beyond the farm gate. So the supply chain needs to lift it on a numeral basis, not a percentage basis, and then it'll be fine.
Yeah, got you. That makes sense. That makes sense. But I'm conscious that I get very caught up in these things and I get fascinated by things, and I'm like a kid on Christmas Eve learning my new words, the MSO and whatever. And I haven't actually done the thing I'm supposed to do as the Monitor Farm podcast host and tie it back to the program itself. So what involvement are you guys having through MSO and the Monitor Farm podcast? You guys, not podcast, program, sorry. I'll let you decide who talks first.
Well, I'm not sure where we're going to be going forward with this, but we've already reviewed farms in Scotland under this scheme, and we've run workshops, particularly in the borders, and we've run training sessions. The dilemma that I have is that introducing MSO into a farm business works best when there is a mentoring element to back up the initial review. So often in England, we do reviews, a huge number of reviews, and there's no backup. There's no follow-up to that. And when we leave a farm business, I mean, I don't know how many farmhouse kitchen tables I've sat around, but when we leave them, the partners in the farm business, generally, they're all on board. But 3 or 4 or 5, 6 weeks, 10 weeks later, they're saying to themselves, what did he say? I'm not sure I can do this. I've lost confidence in this. So I'm hoping there'll be some training for people in Scotland, for MSO advocates in Scotland that can do this mentoring. That's what I hope will happen.
Yeah, yeah, and just confirm, from a Monitor Farm perspective, it's Roxburgh Monitor Farm that's involved. Is that right, Chris? Or
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite exciting. And I think having a group that's already there, in the form of, I know it's on paper, on the face of things, 9 farms, but there's much more to it than that. There's the sort of groups that go with each one, the wee sort of bubbles with each. But yeah, it's quite exciting. Just give us a wee bit more on it, Chris, just from the Monitor Farm side. What sort of, I guess, the practicalities of what's been implemented? What involvement have you had directly?
Okay, so as I said earlier, we do not tell people how to farm. We can't do that. We don't know the land well enough. But what we do is say, this is where your business is. We gather evidence, we have findings, we draw conclusions. We might well then help, if we're mentoring that farmer, to implement those conclusions. But what we do is collect data, and so the data can be either from a proprietary accountancy software, whether it's Xero or some farming program, or more usually we get the statutory accounts. I then reallocate the statutory accounts, and it's important to understand that the statutory accounts are only there to mitigate tax liability. They're not a document that is going to help you make business decisions, because of all the allocations that the accountants have made to mitigate your tax. You lose where you are. So we turn those statutory accounts into management accounts with a hierarchy of decision making that goes with that. And then we'll go through those allocations with the farmer. We'll draw our conclusions. We'll either meet face to face or meet on Zoom, and we will then give our conclusions to the farmer face to face. Much better face to face than over Zoom. When they can eyeball us and we can eyeball them, and that's much better. And then if there's a mentoring element going on, we'll continue whatever it is, whatever's required, weekly, fortnightly, monthly period, for up to 9 to 12 months sometimes.
Do you try carry out as much of this in person as you can?
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we found earlier that it can be a bit tricky on these online apps at times.
It's much better to do it face to face, and it's also much better to have the partners, as many partners there as possible, because then the selling is done by me directly to the partners rather than by one partner trying to sell to the 2 or 3 that weren't there, and that's much more difficult for them.
Angus, it seems like you've went through a journey of not fully confident in the profitability of the business for correct reason, understandable reason, and you've shifted. Are you in a much more confident place from a farm direction perspective now?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
immensely. So, much more confident about the delivery of our business. Very certain about the limitations that once upon a time I would have been very uncertain as to what the limitations were, where the boundaries were in our business in terms of the land's ability to deliver. But having stress tested it and having analyzed over and over and over again the productive data, I can with confidence stand by that and back it up. And I think one of the other things, having our own butchery and processing the animals ourselves brings in another tier of data to my farming system that so few are privy to. I get to see the carcasses hung up in the butchery, and I'm in there every day. I also get to quality control test every steak or most carcasses naturally.
Every steak.
No, like I look at them, like every carcass. I like to do that. I'll take a steak from every carcass. Every steak, that'd be a bit ridiculous. Every carcass, sorry, forgive me. Just because it's or at least when I can, just because it's important to bench test, it's important to critique myself against the competition, So my wife hates eating out with me. Why? Because I buy the steak every time and then I'll whinge about it. Yeah.
But if I can just interject there, Angus, what we can do with Angus is say, what is your break even? Has it improved or has it gone down? And we will particularly look at, or we can't do it on Angus quite so easily, but there's a concept called leverage. If you are above MSO, we can calculate how much for every £1 of revenue above MSO you are, it has cost you. The average, and Angus doesn't fall into this because he's just about at MSO anyway, so his curves look very different to most people. But on average, for a livestock farm, it is costing, for every £1 of revenue above that sweet spot, is costing £2.65. For an arable farm, it's between £4 and £7. For a dairy farm, it might be between 5 and 11. So for every £1 of revenue, we can calculate the actual cost.
That's scary.
It is, and when you do these calculations, you find many farms have gone through the breakback point. So they were profitable. They start throwing fert onto it and feed and better med, and they are not profitable on a pre-support basis. Angus doesn't fit into that, but the only reason we know that, and he knows that, is that he's seen the charts.
So, Wallace, can I just pick up something? You were talking about food security earlier, and I just want to touch on something in relation to MSO that hit me like a barn door when I started going through our change. So I think we've been organic now since about 2007. Now, every system's different. Every farm is unique. Every farmer is different as well and has their own opinions on how to do things. And we're organic, and I wouldn't change that for the world. Chris earlier was talking about, natural capital in terms of farm output being a resource to be managed, right? It's limited. I think the one thing that I think I would say to any farmer that's considering doing an MSO review of their business, particularly if they're in a conventional dynamic and are very dependent on corrective variable inputs, is that yes, it's a transition and it takes time. The time is now. If you want to explore this opportunity, because it's about preparedness. Yeah, look at Ukraine. You brought up Ukraine earlier and what it did to the fertilizer price. Yeah. I've been listening to podcasts recently looking at things like global GDP in relation to climate change. 1.5 degrees. What happens at 1.5 degrees to the global food market? How is that going to affect the inputs that we're so dependent on in relation to our profitability. And so what MSO does is it provides a hedge on your market and on your system where you can review your dependence on CVCs, which are corrective variable inputs and corrective variable costs, because naturally, if you've become over-dependent, and this is where our beef herd was, yeah? So if you become over-dependent on too many inputs, it takes an awful lot of time to wean that system off to a point where it gets to MSO where it can fully capitalize on its natural capital. It's like a hockey stick. You go down one side, but then when you come out the other side, MSO will take you higher up the hockey stick than you were before. No doubt about it. In every circumstance, it will. But there's an incentive there because ultimately it is about food security. Because if suddenly we do have an issue globally that does affect fertilizer supply or inputs, I mean, getting trace elements for my cattle, I had trouble getting boluses. I do bolus. It's something I'm weaning off. So I've got a program of getting off boluses, and it's through genetic recording. I'm just recording all the cows, and I'm moving away from trace element support. But if you're overly dependent on those inputs, it could radically affect the way your business performs if you cannot get them. You are entirely dependent upon your nature's ability to deliver and natural capital, and then the ability of your herd, your livestock, your stock type to deliver your profit.
It's been a pleasure to have you both on. Thank you. Thank you. It's been really interesting, really good to chat. And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening think, you know what, I better be getting in touch with Chris and seeing what we can do. So thank you. Appreciate your time.
Well,
thanks very much, Wallace.
And thanks so much for the invitation. And probably the first step would be to go through Monitor Farm Scotland if anybody's interested.
Yeah, so get in touch with us if you want to. And that's been Chris Clark and Angus Walton speaking all things maximising sustainable output. I think the next episode is going to be looking at forage crops, and the rest of this series is just looking at various different technologies being implemented and I guess projects being run throughout the Monitor Farm this year. As always, thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you for the next one. See you then.
Thanks, Wallace.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Monitor Farm Scotland podcast. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you get your podcast from for more episodes as we continue to dive into the stories from our Monitor farms. If you want to stay updated with our latest news and events, please visit the Monitor Farm Scotland website and follow us on social media for more updates and keep in the know about what our farms are getting up to. Monitor Farm Scotland is funded by Scottish Government and managed by Quality Meat Scotland and AHDB.